A billionaire mafia boss heard one muffled sob and uncovered a revenge plot 8 years in the making. At first, Grace looked like just another overworked waitress. Poor, exhausted, scared. But the second Gabriel saw her eyes, he knew the past had found him again. Then came the real shock. The man controlling her wasn't acting alone. Someone far more dangerous had put her there on purpose. And Gabriel was about to learn that the girl he wanted to protect had been chosen to destroy him.
Eels. Gabriel Mercer stepped into his domain after a night of violence, the sharp sound of a woman crying cutting through the air. Only 36 years old, this mastermind of the Los Angeles underworld had just finished a brutal trade. Eels. Blood still clinging to his cuffs. This was his world. Tonight he entered Obsidian alone, ditching his guards in a familiar dance of paranoia. Mercer never trusted the books. He wanted the raw, unpolished truth of the room. Eels. Believing the real story lay beneath the corporate sheen. He was looking for the wounds the shadows tried to hide. Eels. Truth lives in the weary eyes of the cooks and the hushed whispers of the waitstaff. Obsidian, a high-end dining spot downtown, was more than a restaurant. It was a machine for laundering cash and trading secrets. To the elite, it was a palace of luxury. Eels. To Mercer, it was a living map. On this Friday, the scene was a carefully crafted lie. The smell of steak and the drift of jazz felt normal. To anyone else, it worked perfectly, but the candlelight and soft laughter only served to hide the fear. Eels. Mercer watched the performance with the cold, distant eyes of a surgeon. Eels. But Mercer knew how to see through the mask. He scanned the floor and found Derek Lawson, the manager. Lawson stood with the arrogance of a king, arms crossed, looming over the dining room. He wasn't managing, he was hunting. Eels. His eyes revealed a desperate need to dominate and terrify. Mercer noted the shift in power with a quiet chill. Then a sound broke through, a jagged sob coming from the back hallway. It was a rhythmic, broken noise. Eels. It was the sound of a person finally snapping under the weight of a world that didn't care. Eels. The crying wasn't for show. It was the sound of someone trying and failing, to hold their soul together. Mercer reached the break room and found a woman in her late 20s. Her body curled as she gripped a table for support. Her breath came in short, Eels. Panicked gasps, her hands trembling with the shock of a cortisol rush. A man stood nearby, whispering fast, trying to pick up the pieces of her broken spirit. Mercer saw the truth immediately. She was at her limit, Eels. A fragile human being trying to act professional while her life burned down around her. Eels. This was a woman living in a cage of fear. When she looked up, Mercer felt a jolt of recognition that hit like a physical blow. Her eyes were jade green. The exact shade of the man who had died in his arms 8 years ago. His own heart raced as he tried to make sense of it. He told himself it was a fluke, a trick of the light, but his blood knew better. Those eyes were a ghost from a night of fire and blood, a case that never ended. He backed away, the past crushing his chest like a lead weight. Eels. Years of war had taught him that coincidences are just lies the mind tells to stay safe. Mercer moved to the bar, his face a mask of calm as he began his watch. He had to know who she was. If this psychological puzzle grips you, Eels, please like and share this report. Subscribe for more entries in this dark case file and turn on notifications. Mercer saw her friend head back to the floor, his movements shaky and wrong. A predator was loose in the room and everyone felt it. Eels. Mercer wasn't leaving until he tore the truth from the shadows. Eels. The waiter, Ryan Torres, was jumpy, his eyes constantly darting back to that hallway, a clear sign of terror. Mercer moved in, asking for a pen just to break the ice and test the waters. He watched Torres jump, his nerves fried and raw. Eels. Mercer stayed close, letting his presence feel heavy and dangerous. When he mentioned the girls crying, Torres went stiff, frozen by a primitive fear. He looked like a man caught between two monsters, unsure which would strike first. Eels. Mercer watched his shallow, uneven breath, knowing exactly how much pressure it took to break a man like this. Eels. Torres blinked too fast and couldn't hold eye contact, offering a weak lie that fooled nobody. To a shark like Mercer, the deception was clear, born from a deep dread of what came next. Mercer used the silence like a blade. Eels. Waiting for the boy to crack under the pressure. Finally, Torres broke. He said her name was Grace, a woman who worked herself to the bone and never complained. She had been there over a year, hiding her pain behind a perfect smile. Eels. She was the perfect prey for a man like Lawson, strong enough to endure but too powerless to fight back. Eels. Grace was trapped by the weight of her own survival. After her mother passed, she was left with $127,000 in debt, a chain that kept her working until she bled. Lawson used that debt like a leash. Heels. He stole her wages and messed with her schedule, knowing she couldn't walk away. It was a textbook case of a workplace predator, using someone's will to live against them. Torres spoke with a bitter edge, the sound of someone who hated his own weakness. Heels. The trauma had become too heavy, and Grace couldn't hide the cracks anymore. Heels. Losing this job would be a death sentence, dragging her back into the cold dark of poverty. Mercer pushed for more, but Torres suddenly went pale, his body screaming at him to run. He saw the threat coming, the manager, Derek Lawson. Heels. Mercer felt the air change as a hostile gaze landed on his back. Torres scrambled away, fumbling with napkins like a frantic animal. He cut the conversation and fled, his eyes wide with the desperate look of a rabbit sensing a wolf. Heels. He was a broken man in a world Lawson built to crush anything soft. Heels. Mercer didn't flinch, acknowledging Lawson without giving him an inch of satisfaction. He slid into the shadows of the bar, watching the room with a cold analytical focus. There he met Jake Morrison. Heels. A 32-year-old operative who had been his eyes and ears inside the staff for 2 years. Morrison was more than a bartender. He was a deep-cover asset feeding Mercer the secrets of the underworld. This bond was how Mercer kept his throne. Heels. Morrison polished a glass with a calm hand, his true identity hidden behind the mask of a servant. Mercer waited for the truth to spill. Heels. Morrison kept his professional mask on, playing the part of a host while the air between them grew heavy. To any observer, it was just small talk, but he was flagging Lawson as a dangerous glitch in the system. Heels. Mercer gave the signal for a full report while acting like he couldn't care less. Morrison kept his hands busy, hiding the exchange of dangerous information about the manager's recent moves. The mission was clear: find Lawson's weakness. Whiskey, neat, Heels. Mercer said the code to start the briefing. Morrison leaned in close, his voice a low, gravelly whisper full of secrets. Heels. Lawson is meeting people in the shadows after hours, using the back alley to hide his tracks. Morrison reported a pattern of secret meetings every 2 weeks with strangers who avoid the front door. These men don't move like normal people. Heels. They have the wary, sharp eyes of career criminals. They don't walk like they have nothing to hide. They move with the tension of men living on the edge of the law. It's a shadow business running right under the restaurant's nose. Heels. Morrison hasn't seen the payload yet, but the signs point to something big. Lawson is playing with fire. Heels. Mercer synthesized the data with dark, instinctual precision. The most jarring detail was Lawson's obsession with a waitress named Grace. His interest wasn't sexual or professional. It was surgical. He was digging into her paternal history. Heels. Hunting for a name, a career, and the exact moment of her father's death. This wasn't simple harassment. It was a deep psychological excavation. As Mercer felt the weight of these findings, his silence darkened. Heels. The past had stopped being a memory and became a volatile, living thing. This manager wasn't just running a restaurant. He was a curator of ghosts, a collector of lethal secrets who had finally found a prize worth keeping. Heels. Gabriel's instincts, sharpened by decades of shadow wars, flagged a dangerous anomaly. Lawson didn't fit the profile of a simple manager. He moved like a high-functioning asset, a manipulator answering to a higher power. Heels. Grace wasn't just an employee. She was a specific target. Shifting into tactical mode, Gabriel paid his bill in order to track Derek's every move. The atmosphere thickened as the manager approached. He walked with a predatory, measured gait. Heels. His face was a masterpiece of deception, wearing the polite, empty smile of a sociopath. But his eyes were frozen, projecting a clinical coldness that belonged in a morgue rather than a dining room. Heels. At 44, Lawson appeared lean and fastidious, a living monument to rigid order. To the trained eye, this perfection was a shield, the distinct mask of a narcissist. When he spoke, his tone was civil but bled with hidden aggression. Heels. He questioned Gabriel's long stay, disguising an interrogation as standard customer care. Gabriel mirrored the man's rhythm, playing the part of the harmless, wealthy patron. He offered a shallow compliment to the decor. Heels. A calculated move to disarm the predator. But when the manager pushed for details on why Gabriel was dining alone, the conversation shifted. It wasn't about hospitality anymore. It was a targeted intelligence probe. Heels. Gabriel kept his mask tight, using a genuine appreciation for the Wagyu to anchor his lies. It was a fragment of truth used to build a fortress. Lawson, however, didn't bite. His eyes narrowed, heels, scanning Gabriel's features for a familiar pattern in his memory. He claimed they'd met before, the oldest interrogation trick in the book. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken threats. This was no longer a dinner service. It was a cold assessment, feels. Lawson was hunting for a crack in the armor, his every word dripping with the paranoia of a man who sees every stranger as a potential executioner. Feels. Being identified now would end everything. Yet Gabriel's heart rate never climbed. His breathing remained deep and even the mark of a seasoned killer. He locked eyes with the manager, offering nothing but a blank stare. He gave Lawson an out, Eels, suggesting he simply had a common face. The manager went still, searching for a twitch, a bead of sweat, any sign of a lie. Finding nothing, he surrendered with a smile that never reached his eyes, a hollow, mechanical gesture, Eels. This brief exchange confirmed the truth. Lawson wasn't just a threat. He was a high-functioning predator navigating this social landscape with lethal intent. Eels. Lawson retreated but kept his eyes locked on his target. He spoke the usual polite nonsense, but his focus shifted as he explored. He shot a sharp look at Grace. In my world, that is the gaze of a possessive narcissist. It wasn't a boss checking an employee. It was a jailer monitoring a prisoner. Grace's immediate reaction told the rest of the story. She flinched, her spirit crushed under his thumb. She was a victim of psychological warfare, caught in a loop of terror she couldn't escape. Heels. Grace's physical reaction was loud, a tremor in her hands, her shoulders pulled tight. These are the classic scars of chronic fear, and Lawson was the trigger. She wasn't just working, she was surviving. Heels. Gabriel watched as the manager whispered to another employee, delegating the watch. This triangulation is a standard move when the stakes are high. Lawson's paranoia was now a weapon. He wanted Gabriel exposed and dealt with. Still, Heels. Gabriel sat like a statue, sipping his whiskey and hiding his knowledge of the trap. This game of cat and mouse had just entered a much deadlier phase. Heels. Lawson's profile was coming into focus. He was a mid-level handler in a larger syndicate, managing secrets and people like Grace. His obsession with her bloodline was the engine driving his cruelty. Now he saw Gabriel as a rival in the tall grass. Heels. Gabriel left the building, stepping into the quiet of the night to think. The empty parking lot offered the silence he needed. He had to understand why this girl's green eyes were tearing at his old wounds. Grace was no longer just a curious case. Heels. Saving her had become a psychological necessity. Heels. Watching from the dark, Gabriel saw Grace through the window. She stood broken, her hair hiding her face like a shroud. Then the light hit her eyes, a brilliant jade flecked with gold. The sight hit him like a physical blow, dragging him back 8 years. Heels. The darkest memory of his life flooded his mind, drowning out the present. 8 years ago, Gabriel was 28, the crown prince of a criminal empire. He had no idea that his world was about to be torn apart by a single, Heels, bloody act of betrayal that would change everything. Heels. Imagine an armored car, shielding Gabriel and his father, Robert Mercer. Robert was the king of the Los Angeles underworld, and in the front sat Thomas Sullivan. Thomas was a man of iron loyalty, Heels, a protector with those haunting green eyes who had served them for 20 years. To Gabriel, he was more than security. He was a father figure, but their safety was a lie. As the car drove down a lonely road, the world shattered. Heels. Blinding white lights and the thunder of automatic gunfire announced the beginning of a massacre that would leave no one unchanged. Heels. The gunfire was relentless, tearing through the heavy armor like paper. Robert Mercer died in a heartbeat, his chest opened by a lead storm. Gabriel tried to move, but Thomas Sullivan pinned him down. Thomas became a human shield, Heels, absorbing bullet after bullet while firing back with cold mechanical precision. Even as his body was shredded, he refused to fall. He was a wall of muscle and iron, protecting the Mercer legacy until his blood and bullets ran dry. Heels. When he finally collapsed, he was a ghost of a man, his warmth soaking into Gabriel's clothes as the world went silent. Heels. The killers vanished into the night, leaving only carnage behind. Gabriel, the only one left alive, held his dying mentor. Thomas's green eyes were turning dull, the light fading as he struggled to speak through the blood. He gave one final order: live, Heels. Then, with his last breath, he whispered a name: Grace. It was a plea for his daughter, the only thing he loved more than life itself. With that, Thomas Sullivan was gone. He left Gabriel with a debt that couldn't be measured in money. A heavy, Heels, silent promise to a girl he'd never met. Heels. Gabriel took the throne and hunted the traitors. He tried to find Thomas's daughter, but her past had been erased. Eventually, the weight of the empire buried his promise. Trauma hides the truth. But looking at Grace now, the resemblance was undeniable. Her face and those haunting green eyes were a genetic mirror of the man who died for him. The realization hit him with the force of a landslide. The ghost of Thomas Sullivan was standing right in front of him. Heels. Gabriel called his right hand Marcus Webb. His voice was cold, carrying nothing but lethal intent. He demanded a full obsidian file on Grace. He wanted everything: her home, her mother, her entire history. If this was Sullivan's daughter, Heels, then Gabriel had failed his greatest duty for 8 long years. While he built his kingdom, the child of his savior was left to the wolves like Lawson. The bill for 8 years of neglect was finally due. Heels. This investigation into her life was just the start. He was going to set the world on fire for her. Heels. Gabriel sits in the Bentley, a ghost hidden in the long shadows. His gaze is a spotlight burning into the Obsidian restaurant. Behind those glass walls, Grace Sullivan moves through her shift, a lamb unaware of the wolf, Derek Lawson, Heels, watching from the dark. Her world is about to shatter, and she has no idea. Gabriel checks the time, 20 minutes since Marcus called. Seconds stretch like wire, thin and agonizing. His heart drums a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs, Heels. A betrayal of his usual iron mask. If she is truly Thomas Sullivan's blood, the weight of his failure is a physical blow. He has abandoned the legacy of the man who died so he could live. The guilt is a slow poison. Heels, dissolving the stoicism he spent years building. Heels. For 8 long years, she has survived in a vacuum of silence, a ghost Gabriel never saw. The phone vibrates. Marcus. The words on the screen are cold, surgical, a warning of the psychological storm contained within the data. Heels. Gabriel's knuckles turn white against the leather steering wheel. Marcus identifies her. Grace Sullivan, 27 years old, Thomas's daughter. Gabriel's heart skips, a sharp, jagged stutter in his chest. His gut already knew, Heels. But hearing the name out loud is a physical trauma, a blunt force strike to his psyche. Marcus pauses, the silence on the line heavy with the weight of the tragedy he is about to recount. The tragic map of her past is finally laid bare. Heels. The girl is a living testament to a debt unpaid. Heels. After Thomas was gone, Linda Sullivan dragged Grace through a life of backbreaking labor, desperate to buy her daughter a future through education. But the tragedy deepened 6 years ago, a diagnosis of terminal cancer. 10 months of agony followed, Heels, leaving Grace with nothing but the ghost of her mother and a crushing medical debt of $127,000. To a man of Gabriel's wealth, the number is nothing. To a lonely girl, it is a mountain that blocks the sun, Heels. It forced her to walk away from her 3rd year of university, a dream aborted by a checkbook. Since then, she has been a prisoner of menial labor, a victim of a system designed to keep her drowning with no hand to pull her out. Heels. Her life became a blur of waitressing, retail, and cleaning floors. She walked into the trap of the Obsidian 14 months ago. 8 years, Gabriel whispers, the words heavy as lead. He has let her rot for nearly a decade, unprotected and alone. Heels. The memory of Thomas Sullivan's final breaths claws at him, the desperate, unfinished plea of a dying man. He can still see Thomas's green eyes, wide and glassy, a silent accusation of a duty he failed to perform. Heels. Marcus cuts through the darkness with a name, Derek Lawson. The atmosphere shifts to a razor-edge alert. Gabriel's predatory instincts flare. Marcus reveals that Lawson isn't just a manager. He is a jagged piece of a much larger, Heels, more lethal puzzle currently unfolding in the shadows. Heels. Lawson is a shadow cast by Victor Crane. The name hits Gabriel like a physical strike. He freezes, body locking into a state of skulldullness as his grip nearly cracks the steering wheel. He demands to know how Crane is alive. Heels. Certain the man's faction was burned to ash 8 years ago. Marcus corrects the history. Crane didn't die. He vanished, spending a decade rebuilding his empire in the dark. Derek Lawson is his primary weapon. A wave of ancient Heels. Cold rage washes over Gabriel. Victor Crane is the ghost of his past, the architect who built the ambush that killed both Gabriel's father and Thomas Sullivan. The target has changed. The hunt is no longer a memory. It has officially begun again. Heels. Marcus dissects the connection between the manager and the girl. Gabriel sits in the silence, processing the nightmare. Victor Crane knows exactly who Grace is. Her job at the Obsidian wasn't luck. It was a trap set by a man who treats lives like toys. Heels. Gabriel's jaw sets in a line of pure, focused hate. This is a game of multi-generational revenge. Thomas Sullivan had once stood in Crane's way, and now the daughter is paying the father's debt. Grace is a proxy, Heels. A victim being punished for sins she doesn't even know exist. Marcus calls Lawson a handler, a psychological gardener planting seeds of trauma to keep her under control. She is a bird trapped in a cage, made of her own history. Feels. Lawson's questions about Thomas were just a way to mark his prey. Crane has a plan for her, a dark script where the ending is still hidden in the fog. Gabriel looks at the total picture. Grace is a pawn on a sociopath's chessboard. Feels. A child caught in a war that started before she could even drive. When Marcus asks for the next move, Gabriel's voice is a cold blade. He orders the surgical elimination of Derek Lawson. No blood, no trace, no mercy. His focus shifts to the true prize. Feels. Victor Crane. He watches the restaurant where Grace is still working her shift. She is standing in the middle of a killing field, unaware that a storm of blood and fire is circling her. Feels. Gabriel decides that Crane's time in the shadows is over. He steps back into the obsidian with a single burning purpose: find Grace and tell her the truth. Even with the roar of the crowd and the clatter of plates, he has tunnel vision. Feels. He is hunting for those green eyes. When he can't find her on the floor, he slips into the back, into the cold light of the staff quarters. He stops, hearing Lawson's voice, a low, icy threat. The manager is cornering her. Feels. Issuing orders for after-hours work with a tone that drips with intimidation. This is the moment the predator bites down, exerting his power over the weak. Gabriel stands in the darkness, listening, dissecting every cruel syllable Lawson speaks. Feels. Grace's voice is a fragile, trembling thing. She tries to say no, to push back against the demands. Lawson hits her with the cold reality of her life, her debts, her lack of family, her absolute helplessness. It is a masterclass in cruelty. Feels. A predator using a girl's poverty as a leash. He threatens her with the street, stripping away her last shred of security. When he's finished, Lawson walks away, his face a mask of sociopathic boredom. Gabriel stays hidden, feeling a primal, feels, violent urge to tear the man apart right then and there. But he holds back, his mind overriding his bloodlust. He has a larger game to play. For now, Lawson is just a dead man who hasn't stopped walking. Feels. Once Lawson is gone, Gabriel steps out of the shadows. Grace looks like she is ready to shatter, her hands moving in small, desperate circles as she tries to hold herself together. She is breathing fast, feels, her eyes red and dry. She has been stressed for so long that tears won't even come anymore. She is a well that has run dry. Gabriel speaks, his voice low and carefully soft, trying not to spook her. She jumps, feels, her body flinching before she tries to put on her professional mask. It is a tragic sight, the discipline of the broken. She tells him he shouldn't be back there, citing the rules of the restaurant. Gabriel steps closer, feels, watching the walls she's built start to crumble. He approaches her with a rare, quiet empathy, feels. Gabriel tells her he isn't there as a customer. Grace stays on guard, her eyes darting like a trapped bird. When he looks into them, he sees it, the exact green of Thomas Sullivan. It feels like a phantom hand tightening around his throat, feels. He says the name, her father's name. Grace freezes, her face turning into a mask of pale stone. The words seem to steal her breath, leaving her struggling to find a response. She stumbles back, hitting the cold wall for support as her balance fails her, feels. In a voice that is barely a whisper, she asks if he knew him. Gabriel nods, confirming he spent 20 years with the man who is the center of her world's pain, feels. Gabriel tells her that Thomas served his family for 2 decades. The words hit her like a physical shock, clashing with the lie she's lived for years. She tries to fight it, clinging to the story of a logistics worker who died in a car accident, feels. Gabriel shakes his head, cutting through the fantasy. He tells her the truth. Thomas Sullivan was an elite protection officer, a man of violence and loyalty, not a laborer. And he didn't die by accident. Grace's entire worldview collapses in an instant. Feels. She looks at him with the blank stare of the traumatized. He leans in and begins to tell the story of 8 years ago. The ambush, his voice drops, heavy with the blood and the fire of that night. Feels. Gabriel recounts the treachery, the sudden thunder of the ambush. His father fell instantly, a victim of the first volley. Gabriel survived only because Thomas Sullivan stepped into the line of fire. Thomas became a human shield, feels, taking every bullet meant for another. He held his ground, firing back until his body simply gave out. A heavy silence settles over Grace as she absorbs the truth. There are no screams, only a shattering internal grief, feels. Gabriel remembers the end, Thomas dying in his arms. The last word on the man's lips was her name. A final broken promise hung in the air, a debt now etched into Gabriel's soul, feels. Thomas died leaving a debt to his daughter, the girl who was his entire world. Finally, Grace breaks. She trembles, leaning against the cold wall to keep from collapsing. 8 years. She whispers the number like a curse. For 8 years, heals. Her father's memory was a lie. She demands to know why her mother buried the truth so deeply. Gabriel's voice is steady as he explains it was a shield. The world of shadows and blood is no place for a civilian. Heals. Her mother built a wall of secrets to keep the darkness away from her child. It was a desperate, suffocating act of love. Heals. Grief tears through Grace, transforming her father from a ghost into a fallen martyr. Gabriel watches the cracks form in her soul, seeing the void left by nearly a decade of lies. He steps in as her new anchor, her new protector. His vow is quiet, possessive, and absolute. He claims her safety as his own. He will never let her be broken again. Feels. The air shifts as Derek Lawson strides into the hall. Grace flinches instinctively, falling back into a state of total submission. Her body reacts before her mind can even process his barked orders. In an instant, she is no longer a woman, but a broken spirit answering the call of a predator. She is a victim performing a role she learned far too well. Feels. A year of constant fear had wired her for retreat, but Gabriel blocks the exit. He stands like a wall, cold and unmoving. Derek tries to puff his chest, playing the big man with a threatening glare. He has no idea he is facing a man who breathes violence and lives for control. He is a child playing at power in the shadow of a god. Heals. Derek is used to being the biggest dog in the room, but Gabriel's eyes scan him like a wolf deciding where to bite. He isn't just a businessman. He is the man who owns the world. When the name Mercer is spoken, the air leaves the room. Derek's ego shatters instantly. Arrogance turns to a cold, paralyzing terror that roots him to the spot. Heals. In the underworld of Los Angeles, Mercer is a name that demands total silence. Derek's bravado evaporates under Gabriel's heavy stare. The kingpin begins. The cruelty, the petty tyranny. Derek can't even find the words to lie. His face turns ash white as his secrets are dragged into the light. He is a dead man standing, and he knows it. Feels. Gabriel moves in closer, pinning Derek against the reality of his own ruin. He reveals every secret text, every hidden call, shattering the man's illusion of privacy. Grace watches, her world tilting on its axis. Her mysterious customer isn't just a hero. He is the master of everything. He is the invisible hand that controls the very floor beneath her feet. Feels. Gabriel turns back to Grace, softly explaining that her tormentor no longer matters. A flicker of hope shines in her eyes, a dangerous bond forming with a new, stronger master. Beside them, Derek is a ghost of a man. He trembles, his power stripped away until there is nothing left. In this world of wolves, he has finally realized he is nothing but sheep. Feels. The sentence is handed down with a chilling, flat voice. Derek touched something that belonged to Gabriel, a sin that requires a brutal price. It is a final, terminal command. As Derek slinks away like a beaten dog, Gabriel pulls Grace closer. Her loneliness is gone, replaced by the heavy, suffocating weight of his shadow. For the first time, she feels safe and utterly owned. Feels. The door clicks shut like a tomb. Derek is a mess, shoulders hunched, hands twisting, a fake smile plastered on his face. He tries to explain away his cruelty, calling it business, but Gabriel cuts him off with a look. The game is over. The predator is finished playing with his food. There are no more excuses left, only the cold silence of the end. Feels. Gabriel looms over him, waiting for the final crack to appear. He drops a name like a bomb, Victor Crane. The effect is instant and devastating. Derek's face goes ghost white as he realizes his double cross is out in the open. Gabriel's words hit like lead weights, one after another, crushing what little remains of the manager's spirit until he is absolutely broken. Heals. Gabriel lays out the evidence with surgical detail. Every secret meeting and midnight call was watched. He demands one thing, Victor Crane's location. It is a simple choice. Tell the truth or die. Derek tries to lie, a weak and desperate reflex. But Gabriel moves into his space, looming like a mountain. The manager collapses into a state of pure, shaking terror and starts to talk. Heals. The man finally snaps. He gives up the address, a rotting warehouse on the edge of the city. Gabriel listens without emotion as the full truth spills out. Victor Crane has been stalking him for 3 years, a sick obsession fueled by hate. Now that darkness is coming to a head in the ruins of the industrial zone, waiting for its final act. Heals. Victor Crane is a monster who craves a symphony of pain. He does not just want Gabriel dead, he wants his soul destroyed. His plan is a tragedy of revenge, using Grace as the tool to tear Gabriel apart. The air in the room grows heavy as the truth sinks in. This is not just a fight, it is a descent into the darkest parts of humanity. Feels. Inside, Gabriel is a storm of cold fury. He moves to cut out the rot, treating Derek Lawson like surgical waste. He speaks with a low, lethal hum, already planning his next move. The manager is given 15 minutes to disappear forever, a ghost sent into the night. Gabriel does not look back. He is already focused on the blood that must be spilled. Feels. Clean. The word is a death sentence, delivered with a face of stone. Derek is paralyzed by terror, but Gabriel leaves without a single glance back. The days that follow are a blur for Grace. She lives in a glass palace high above the city, a world of silent luxury that feels like a dream. She watches the lights below like a ghost haunting her own life, safe but utterly disconnected. Feels. Gabriel prepares for war with the precision of a predator stalking its prey. He maps out every move against Victor Crane, his mind a storm of strategy. Yet he returns to Grace for quiet meals, a carefully crafted performance of normal life. They talk about her lost dreams and his debt to her father. With every word, he weaves himself deeper into her story. He is becoming her only world, her protector, and her destiny. Feels. He watches her from the shadows, noticing how she clings to her books. Gabriel sees her soul through the pages' turns. He buys her new volumes, the very ones she once dreamed of owning. It is a move of perfect psychological grace. Her throat tightens and her hands shake as she takes them. She thinks it is kindness, a warmth she has not felt in years. But it is a trap, binding her to him with every word she reads. Feels. She whispered her thanks, and for a heartbeat, in Gabriel's eyes seemed to crack. It was the look of a man drowning in the wreckage of his own soul. Later that night, restless and haunted, Grace found him on the balcony. He stood there without his armor, his jacket, exposed and raw. Jagged, silver scars crisscrossed his back like a map of old wars. They were the brutal receipts of a life spent in blood and fire, now gleaming under the cold, clinical wash of the moon. Feels. Grace stepped closer to the ruins of his skin. When she asked about the damage, his voice was a ghost. It happened the night her father saved him. Thomas Sullivan had become a human shield, taking the lead meant for Gabriel. As her fingers brushed the twisted tissue, Gabriel went rigid. It was a gentle touch, a sensation completely foreign to a man who only knew the bite of steel and the sting of betrayal. That soft contact, through the thin fabric, tore a hole right through his carefully built walls. Feels. This wasn't a demand or a duty. It was just one broken soul recognizing another. 8 long years of carrying her father's ghost led to this a heavy, unspoken connection in the dark. A doctor might call it the start of a bond, a classic sign of Stockholm Syndrome. But the moment shattered when the radio hummed. Marcus had news. The mission was set for tomorrow. The hit on Victor was a go. Just like that, Gabriel was pulled back into his world of cold steel, leaving the warmth of Grace behind. Feels. Gabriel nodded, the weight of the timeline settling like a shroud. A sudden sharp premonition clawed at him, the kind of gut feeling that keeps soldiers alive. He could sense a variable he couldn't name. Feels. A storm rolling in toward the girl he had promised to guard. Later, hunched over maps and satellite shots, he and Marcus finalized the warehouse raid. Victor Crane's sanctuary looked small from space. 20 men, Feels. 3 teams, a perfect circle of death meant to close in on the enemy until there was nowhere left to run. Feels. On paper, the plan was flawless. Seal the exits, hit the front, leave no survivors. But Gabriel was distracted by a primal twitch in his gut. His very bones knew the smell of an ambush. When Marcus asked if he was all right, Gabriel waved him off, but the lie died when the lights flickered and went black. Total darkness swallowed the room. Then came the rhythmic thunder of automatic fire. The breach was real. His fortress, his safe haven, was being torn open from the inside out. Feels. Hell broke loose as the hallways turned into a slaughterhouse. This wasn't a lucky strike. It was a surgical betrayal from his own inner circle. The alarms weren't just bypassed, they were gutted. As his men fell to muffled gunshots, Feels. Gabriel didn't think about the war. The cold strategist vanished, replaced by a man terrified for the only person who mattered. Get Grace to safety, he roared at Marcus, ignoring the targets in the dark as he charged into the fire. Feels. He was breaking every rule of survival, driven by a desperate, irrational need to keep her alive. Feels. The defense crumbled in seconds. A bullet caught Marcus in the shoulder, and a heavy blow to the head sent Gabriel into the black. When he woke, he was pinned to the floor, a heavy boot crushing his chest. Then he saw him. Victor Crane had aged into a living mask of malice. His face was stone, his eyes like twin pits of ink, empty of anything resembling a soul. He was a predator who fed on the agony of others. And now he stood over Gabriel with a smile that was colder than the grave. Heels. Victor loomed over his prize, his voice a poisonous hiss of 8 years of hate. He had lived for this, to watch the Mercer legacy bleed out on the floor. Gabriel stared back, his eyes like flint, refusing to give this monster the satisfaction of a flinch. Heels. Victor's dry, jagged laugh filled the ruined room, savoring every second of his triumph. He had crawled through the shadows of the past, just to see Gabriel Mercer on his knees. He leveled his weapon, his finger itching for the final, Heels, permanent end to their long and bloody tragedy. Heels. With a twisted pride, Victor confessed to the original hit, his obsession with erasing the Mercer name from the city. But he hadn't planned for Thomas Sullivan. That one act of sacrifice had ruined him, Heels, forcing him to live like a rat in the dark for 10 long years. Now his revenge was growing. Killing Gabriel wasn't enough. He wanted to break Thomas Sullivan's daughter too, making her pay for her father's sins in the most brutal way possible. Heels. It was the ultimate act of a hollow man, seeking to destroy everything beautiful out of spite. Heels. Gabriel lunged at the mention of Grace, but the chains and the guards held firm. Victor just laughed, the sound signaling the start of a hunt through the dark corridors. In her room, Grace woke to a nightmare. Heels. Her heart hammered against her ribs as her instincts took over, driving her toward the hidden safe room. She bolted, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she slammed the door shut. Inside, the wall of monitors flickered to life, giving her a cold, Heels, electronic view of the horror unfolding in the living room just a few feet away. Heels. The screens showed a scene of total defeat. Gabriel was on his knees, a gun held to his head by a ghost in the shadows. Next to him, Marcus lay in a growing pool of crimson, his body still and broken. The room was filled with faceless killers, but Victor was the one who drew the eye, a predator without a trace of mercy in his face. Grace watched the feed, her palms flat against the cold glass, realizing the first time how fragile she was and how close her protector was to being erased. Heels. Victor's voice cut through the audio feed like a blade. Thomas Sullivan died for you, Gabriel. He took the bullets so you could breathe. His laugh was a jagged, cruel. But your hero is gone and no one is coming to save you tonight. Grace stumbled back, hitting the cold wall of the bunker. The truth hit her harder than any blow. Her father hadn't died in an accident. He had died for this man. Now his killer was here to finish the job. She could stay hidden, or she could do something. Heels. Safety was just a lie, she told herself. She could hide and live, but Gabriel would die. She felt a pull toward him she couldn't explain, a bond forged in the wreckage of their lives. This man had been her only companion, Heels, showing her a kindness she hadn't known since her mother was alive. If he fell, she would be alone again, haunted by more ghosts. Grace closed her eyes and pictured her father, Heels. She remembered his gaze, those same green eyes she saw in the mirror every morning, looking at her with a love that felt like it would never end. Heels. He gave his life for a stranger. That was the real inheritance Thomas Sullivan left her. Not money, but the courage to sacrifice everything. Grace opened her eyes, her shaking hands suddenly still. She looked around the bunker. Heels. Gabriel said it had everything she needed. She found it in the bottom drawer, a heavy black handgun. She didn't know anything about weapons or how to handle the kick, and her pulse was still racing. But she knew how a trigger worked. Heels. And in a world of monsters, sometimes that simple, violent action is enough to change the ending of the story. Heels. Grace held the gun tight, its weight cold in her palm, and walked toward the door. She took one long breath and stepped into the dark. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows, filled with the muffled sounds of the killers in the next room. She moved like a ghost. Heels. Her heart pounding in her ears, but she didn't stop. At the door, she heard Victor's final, mocking question. Any last words, Gabriel, before I send you to meet your father? Grace didn't hesitate. She stepped out of the black, Heels, gun leveled at the man in the center. Stop. Every head turned. The world shifted. Heels. In that cold, tension-filled room, Marcus lay bleeding as Gabriel watched in a state of sheer psychological horror. Grace, please stop, he begged. Victor's smirk widened, his fleeting shock twisting into the cruel delight of a born narcissist. Heels. Thomas Sullivan's daughter, he murmured, savoring the bitter irony. How perfect. I was going to hunt you down, and here you are. Grace's hand shook violently, but her aim stayed true. Let him go. Victor let out a hollow laugh. And then what? Heels. You have no idea how to use that thing. Grace didn't waste another word. Her finger simply pulled back the trigger mechanism. Heels. The gunshot shattered the silence. The lead grazed past Victor, tearing into a subordinate's shoulder instead. Total chaos erupted instantly. As the gunman turned, Victor saw his opening and leveled his weapon at Grace. He fired without a second thought. Heels. The bullet slammed into her stomach like a physical blow, and she watched the red bloom across her shirt before her legs gave out. She collapsed. Grace. Gabriel's scream was raw, the sound of a man losing his soul. In a frenzy of grief, Heels, he tore through his captors. Nearby, Marcus grabbed a fallen pistol and dropped 2 guards, the tide of the battle finally turning in their favor. Heels. The room became a slaughterhouse. Grace lay there bleeding out, her eyes locked on the ceiling as she whispered to the ghost of her father. Was this right? Gabriel's mind snapped, replaced by the lethal instincts of a predator. Heels. 10 years of surviving the underworld exploded into a blind, terrifying rage. He lunged at Victor with 8 years of pent-up hatred. The narcissist was too slow to react. Gabriel's fist smashed into his face. Heels. Sending him stumbling back as his gun skittered across the floor, useless and cold. But a man like Victor wasn't going down that easily. Not without a fight to the absolute death. Heels. Victor didn't survive decades on luck alone. He rolled with the punch and caught Gabriel's jaw with a sickening thud. They collided with savage animal intensity. No guns, no knives, just raw power and a deep, poisoned hatred. Gabriel swung wildly. Heels. Victor parried, striking back hard. They wrestled across the floor, crashing into furniture and leaving bloodstains on the walls. In the background, Marcus and the guards were locked in a deadly firefight, the air thick with screams and lead. Heels. But Gabriel heard nothing. He was gone, lost in a cold, dissociative state where only his target existed in the entire world. Heels. Everything else faded away. You killed my father, Gabriel screamed, raining blows down on Victor's face. You stole Thomas from me. He hit him again. You hurt Grace. That last strike sent the narcissist to the floor. Gabriel pounced. Heels. His fingers locking around Victor's throat. The man's desperate scratching meant nothing. Gabriel's eyes were bloodshot, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was ready to kill. He was going to end it right here. But then, Heels. A tiny sound broke through his tunnel vision, a whisper barely audible over the violence. Gabriel heard it like a direct call to his very soul. Heels. Was I right? Just like my dad? Grace. Gabriel's world shattered. She was only feet away, her life spilling out onto the floor. Her green eyes stared into nothing, talking to a ghost. It was a cruel cycle of trauma. 8 years ago, Heels. He held Thomas Sullivan and watched those same green eyes grow dim. Thomas's last wish was for Grace to live. Now history was repeating itself. The daughter was following the father into the dark. Heels, bleeding out and asking the same tragic questions about her soul that had haunted him years before. The cycle of pain was complete. Heels. Gabriel let go. Victor didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered but her. He scrambled to Grace, pulling her head into his lap. Grace, stay with me. Her eyes fluttered, finally finding his. She gave him a faint, heartbreaking smile. Are you okay? She breathed. Heels. Gabriel's heart felt like it was breaking. Even as she was dying, her only concern was for him. I am fine. You are going to make it. Listen to me. He pressed down on the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Heels. Her blood on his hands felt like his own life was draining away into the cold floor. Heels. Get help now, he barked at Marcus. Call an ambulance. Marcus fumbled with his phone, hands shaking from the adrenaline. Gabriel turned back to Grace. Her eyes were clouded, her life slipping away. Would my dad be proud? She asked. Heels, her voice a tiny thread of sound. For the first time in 8 years, Gabriel's mask crumbled. He will be so proud of you, but you have to stay awake. I need to tell you that every day. Do you hear me? She gave him one last, Heels, fragile smile before her eyes closed. Grace, he panicked, but she was still breathing. Just barely. Heels. She was still breathing, though it was shallow. She had passed out from the blood loss. Far off, the wail of sirens promised help was coming. Gabriel didn't let go of her, his entire being focused on her pulse. Behind them, Heels. Marcus had Victor pinned and restrained. The monster's fate didn't matter now. There was only Grace, suspended in that terrible space between life and the end. You are going to be okay, Gabriel whispered, a solemn promise to the universe. Heels. I am not losing you. I will not let you go like I let Thomas go. Heels. The medics arrived within 10 minutes. They worked fast, stabilizing Grace and lifting her onto a stretcher. Gabriel watched them, his hands still covered in her blood. He felt like he was falling apart. But before they left, he had one last thing to do. Heels. Victor was still on the floor, his body shattered from the fight. He was alive, but barely, his limbs twisted at impossible angles. He groaned in pain, but his eyes still burned with pure hatred as Gabriel stood over him. The roles had finally flipped. Heels. The victim was now the one in control of the tragedy. Heels. Gabriel stared down at the man who had destroyed his world 8 years ago. Victor Crane, the monster who killed Gabriel's father and drove Thomas Sullivan to his death. Victor, broken and bleeding, actually begged him to end it. Heels. But Gabriel's eyes were like ice. For a man like this, a quick death was a kindness he didn't deserve. No, he deserved a lifetime of misery and regret instead. He nodded to Marcus to take him away. Heels. Marcus grabbed the ruined man by the collar and dragged him off into the dark shadows to await his fate. Heels. Victor's screams faded into the background as Gabriel left the ruined penthouse. All he could think about was the ambulance carrying Grace to the hospital. He drove like a man possessed, his only thought her survival. At the ER, Heels. They rushed her into surgery, the doors slamming shut between them. Gabriel watched through the glass as the surgeons surrounded her fragile form. When they finally pulled the curtain, he slumped into a hard plastic chair. All his strength was gone. Heels. The cold, calculated man was gone, replaced by someone utterly broken by the weight of it all. Heels. Her blood was still on his skin, drying into dark streaks he couldn't bring himself to wash off. He sat there in a daze for 4 long hours. Every minute felt like a lifetime. Every time those doors swung open, his heart hammered against his ribs. Heels. In his desperation, Gabriel did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He prayed. In that cold, sterile hallway, smelling of bleach and machines, he begged some unknown power to save the girl with the green eyes. Heels. He pleaded for her life as the world went on around him. Heels. He prayed for Grace, the only thing left of the man who gave his life for him. She had done exactly what her father did, putting herself in the line of fire to save him. After 4 brutal hours, the surgeon finally walked out. Gabriel was on his feet in a second. The doctor told him the bullet had barely missed her liver, but she had lost a lot of blood. The good news? She was strong. She was going to make it through the night. Gabriel finally let out the long breath he had been holding in his chest. Heels. The relief hit him like a wave. Grace was going to live. He followed a nurse to the recovery room where Grace lay still. She looked so small and pale, with machines doing the work of breathing for her. The steady beep of the monitor was the only music he wanted to hear. Gabriel sat down beside her and took her steps. She was alive, even if she was still deep in sleep. He just sat there, watching her chest rise and fall, a silent witness to her survival against all the odds. Heels. Her hand felt like cold marble, but the faint thrum of a pulse beneath her skin offered a desperate reassurance. Gabriel leaned in close, whispering into the sterile air that he was not going anywhere. For 48 hours he sat motionless, heels, ignoring hunger and the heavy pull of sleep. He became a ghost in the recovery room, eyes fixed on the heart monitor's jagged green line as if his own breath depended on its rhythm. When nurses tried to coax him away, he silenced them with a sharp heels. Wordless look, he was a sentinel bound to her by a state of absolute, unwavering vigilance. Heels. Gabriel did not move. Marcus came and went, bringing news of Victor Crane's descent into a dark site for permanent psychological ruin. The monster's fate was written, yet Gabriel's world had narrowed to the girl in the hospital bed. Heels. On the 3rd morning, pale sunlight cut through the ward's shadows, and Grace finally stirred. Her green eyes fluttered, squinting against the brightness before finding Gabriel's face. He was hovering over her, his stare so intense it felt sharp, heels, like a surgeon waiting for the first sign of life. He had been holding his breath for this exact second. Heels. Gabriel looked like a shell of himself. Days of neglect had left him with a jagged beard and bruised, hollow pits beneath his eyes. The king of Los Angeles' underworld looked like he had just crawled out of a wreckage. Grace tried to find her voice, heels, though her throat felt like sand and iron. She finally forced out a dry, rasping whisper, cracking the heavy silence by telling him he looked like hell. A ragged breath escaped Gabriel's lungs, heels, the crushing weight finally lifting from his chest as he realized she was really back with him. Heels. He whispered her name again, anchoring himself to the fact that she was alive. Slowly, the fractured pieces of memory returned to Grace. The screams in the safe room, the flash of the muzzle. Fear flickered in her eyes as she asked about Victor. Heels. Gabriel's face went cold, a shadow passing over his brow as he confirmed the threat was gone forever. Victor was erased. Grace felt a heavy stone drop from her heart, but the peace was fleeting. One question still haunted her, heels, a question for the man whose shadow she had just stepped into. Heels. She asked if her father would have been proud. Gabriel's eyes softened, revealing a rare glimpse of the man behind the mask. He told her Thomas Sullivan would have probably yelled at her for being so reckless. Feels. Her father would have hated seeing his daughter standing in front of a killer's gun. But then, Gabriel's voice dropped to a low tremor. He told her Thomas would be immensely proud. Grace had echoed her father's ultimate choice from 8 years ago, Feels, shielding another life with her own body. Gabriel's words trailed off, his throat tightening as the memory of his old friend surged back. Feels. Grace saw the depth of his thanks in the set of his jaw. She reached out, her fingers trembling until they found his. Gabriel grabbed her hand with a desperate strength, holding on as if she might dissolve into the hospital air. Feels. She whispered her thanks for the truth and for keeping her safe. Gabriel did not say a word. His crushing grip was the only promise he needed to make. In the amber glow of the morning, their silence spoke louder than any doctor's report. Feels. Something had shifted forever, a new connection forged in the heat of blood and fire. Feels. A dark invisible thread now bound them together, a tether made of shared scars and spilled blood. As the days passed, Grace slowly regained her strength, but Gabriel was the one who truly changed. He never left. He slept in a hard, Feels, plastic chair and ate the same tasteless food she did. When she grew tired, he read to her, his hands once used for violence now gentle as he cared for her. The feared kingpin had shed his cold skin, replaced by a man consumed by a fierce, Feels, protective devotion to the girl who had nearly died for him. Feels. When the doctors gave the word, Gabriel was the one who helped her take those first shaky steps. The man who ruled the city was now her literal crutch, a strange reversal of power. One evening, as the shadows grew long, Feels, he finally spoke about what had happened. He told her she had saved him in the exact same way her father did 8 years ago. His voice was heavy, each word carrying the weight of a decade's worth of guilt. He admitted that he was now in her debt, Feels, owing her his life just as he once owed Thomas Sullivan. Feels. Grace shook her head, a small smile touching her lips at the mention of debt. She told him she did not want payment for what she had done. She had protected him because he gave her the truth about her father and for the quiet moments they had shared in the dark. Deep down, she knew she just could not bear the thought of him being gone. It was not about duty. It was something deeper, a bond forged in the wreckage of their lives. She met his gaze with steady green eyes, closing the book on their debts for good. Feels. What is it you want? Gabriel asked, his voice falling into a low, hypnotic velvet, while his eyes remained fixed on her with predatory intensity. Grace sat in the quiet, her mind drifting back through 8 long years of loneliness. Feels. She remembered the 6 years spent tending to her dying mother, the slow fade of the only person she had left. She had been a slave to bills and debt, drifting through life without a single hand to hold. Loneliness was all she knew. Feels. I do not want to be alone anymore, she whispered, the truth cutting through the air. For 8 years, she had existed in a void. She had buried her parents and survived Derek's cruelty entirely on her own. She was just so tired of being alone. Feels. She looked at him, her eyes shimmering with the weight of her grief. I do not need you to owe me, she said quietly. I just need the silence to stop. Gabriel watched her, his dark pupils expanding as something deep inside him finally shifted. Feels. He reached out, his hand closing over hers in a grip that was as much a cage as it was a sanctuary. You will not be alone, he promised, his voice cold and steady like a blood oath. Not ever again. Grace felt the heat of his skin. Feels. A grounding force in her chaotic world. There were no grand gestures or words of love, just a silent, unbreakable contract signed in the pressure of their joined hands, and a gaze that refused to look away. Feels. Outside, the sun began to sink, bleeding a violent orange across the horizon. The dying light flooded the sterile room, painting them both in a warm, cinematic glow. Grace turned to Gabriel, and for the first time, Feels. The hollow ache in her chest felt like it was finally closing. The old shadows of despair were retreating. 3 months later, Grace stood before a mirror in a sleek, high-security penthouse. The wound in her side had closed, Feels, leaving a silver mark against her skin. She did not hate the scar. To her, it was a badge of her own will, a jagged line of history that proved she had finally taken control of her own fate, just like her father had before her. Feels. Her healing went deeper than skin and bone. 3 months in Gabriel's fortress, shielded by his shadow, had finally silenced the echoes of her long isolation. The shivering girl from the break room was gone, replaced by someone steadier. Feels. The change was written on both of them. A week after she left the hospital, Gabriel handed her a stack of papers. Her debt, $127,000, was gone. When she tried to push it back, his eyes remained cool and calculating. Deals. He told her it was not a gift. He framed the money as a back payment, a loyalty fund built by her father over decades of service to his family's empire. Deals. He gave my family 20 years, Gabriel said softly. This is just a late payment. Grace could not argue with that, though she knew no amount of money could ever pay for a life. With the crushing weight of debt finally gone, she went back to finish her degree. No more dead-end shifts or counting pennies. She finally had the breathing room to build a real future. While Grace studied, Gabriel kept his iron grip on the city, as feared as ever by those in the dark. But his inner circle noticed something different. On the outside, he was still ice and steel, but deep within, the gears of his soul were being slowly, carefully rebuilt. Marcus and Jake saw the cracks in the armor first. Gabriel was still the ruthless predator they feared, but the rhythm of his life had shifted. Mid-negotiation, he would glance at his phone, a ghost of a smile haunting his lips. His schedule now bowed to her, to the quiet ritual of their shared meals. Tonight, Grace stood on the balcony, watching the Los Angeles skyline shimmer like fallen stars. The night air was biting, yet she felt a warmth. A strange serenity she once thought was impossible. Behind her, the floorboards groaned under a familiar, heavy tread. She didn't need to turn. Her heart knew the weight of his shadow before he even spoke. Gabriel stepped into the frame, his hand extending a glass of wine into the moonlight. They stood in that heavy, shared silence that only two survivors can truly understand. Grace finally broke the spell. Her voice a soft tremor as she asked what the future held for them. Gabriel looked at her with eyes that were suddenly dangerously transparent, admitting he had no map for this territory. He left the choice in her hands. She replayed the last 90 days, the shared meals, the books he had given her, the hours of whispered truths on this very balcony. He had not guarded her like a prisoner, but like something precious. For the first time, she felt whole. I want to try, she said, her words chosen with the precision of a surgeon before a genuine smile lit her face. Gabriel watched her for a long beat, his own expression softening into a rare, jagged reflection of her warmth. They turned back to the city lights, their bodies maintaining a quiet, tethered contact. There were no grand declarations, just two traumatized people acknowledging their shared history of blood and grief. They were ready to step into a new chapter together. To the east, the darkness began to thin, signaling the arrival of the dawn. A rare sense of hope hung in the air. This proves a blood debt can be settled with grace instead of violence. Even in the deepest trauma, healing is possible. Grace survived the loss of everything she loved without letting the darkness swallow her whole. Gabriel, raised in a world of wolves, managed to keep his loyalty to the man who spared him. The lesson here is simple. We are not built for the cold silence of isolation. We need the heat of another person to get through the nights when the shadows grow too long. If you find yourself lost in your own crisis, remember that being alone is not a life sentence. Reaching out, building new bridges, and allowing yourself to be seen can be the single most important step in your own survival. There is always a way back from the edge.